So Ken, I wanted to ask you about your career leading up to the point you came to the bank and set up the carbon business.
That was a long time ago. Well, I guess I started heading towards the bank towards the end of my doctorate when the first oil crisis broke out, and I was looking at the nexus between environment, energy, and health in studying the human ecology of Hong Kong, and found that because I had to find where all the energy was used and why people were using different forms of energy, so I could track their byproducts, that I was really in the energy planning business, and that was very exciting. So I gradually moved away from medicine into energy planning, and that led me then to look at the change that was going on in Papua New Guinea for people who grew up in the village environment and moved for employment and other reasons into the towns, and what impact that had on their consumption of all kinds, but I looked at the energy side of that. And in the process, the government of Papua New Guinea, who I tried to keep informed from time to time, said, well, we don't have an energy planning function. All we do is let petroleum concessions and tax petroleum products. Would you like to set that up? Because we like what you're thinking about in terms of renewable energy. So I got leave from the university as a research scientist and set up the Energy Planning Administration, wrote the first energy policy for Papua New Guinea. Never been one since, but they're now writing one and again are asking me to come out and review it. And it was a heavily focused renewable energy, domestic energy source policy. And then the power system collapsed. And then I was asked to review why, and then after we found out why, they said, well, why don't you run the power company as its CEO and fix it up. I was a kid then, of course, but I managed to get it done, turn it around, and in the process, the IMF noticed what I was doing, pursuing management by objective and stuff like that, and setting things right. And so they said, we're telling the World Bank that you exist, and you'll probably get an offer soon. So I did. I didn't really believe it, and I wasn't sure I wanted to go, but after several death threats for laying off all the people in Papua New Guinea that I laid off to save the power company, I decided to come. And so I came to the bank as an energy specialist at the end of 1982. So after the bank, I went back into the private sector, and I've enjoyed it immensely and built on everything that I learned in the bank, and I want to continue to do that.
Okay. And coming to the carbon market, when was the first time you remember coming up with the idea to do something of that kind?
Yeah, I remember it very distinctly. It's one of those moments that sticks in one's mind, like getting your finger caught in a rat trap or something like that as a kid. I was walking across a road in Rio, in the midst of the Earth Summit, thinking about how ridiculous it was that the developing countries and some of the industrialized countries were suggesting that there could be a flow of $350 billion a year to implement the global environment conventions, which, as you recall, were signed by most countries at that time. And aid at that time was leveling out at $50 billion a year, aid flows. So I thought, how ridiculous that you could ever imagine another $350 billion to address these global problems. And so it occurred to me that the only way that could conceivably be done was through a public-private partnership model with the involvement of the private sector with, in principle, endless capital and a great deal of entrepreneurship. So that's when I conceived of what was then called the Carbon Investment Fund and started to market it around as an idea. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember you coming to Delhi immediately after the Earth Summit and talking about it. I had just finished my PhD, and I think I've told you the story that I was asked to transcribe the whole thing, and I had no idea what you were talking about till about almost 8 or 9 years later when I joined you to work on this. But from Rio in 92 to 96, 97, when actually you put the idea forward, what was the process?
Oh, it's very tough. one of the toughest things I'm doing something like it again now, and I'm sort of, thinking back, and I need to be patient because these things take a while. So first of all, I found a sponsor, which was the Norwegian government, and some Norwegian personalities that I fondly remember, who thought this was a good idea, invited me to come after the Earth Summit in, I think it was September, to talk about this, and said that they liked the idea of a market and public-private partnerships. I mean, kind of who doesn't, but they saw the possibilities. They didn't like the idea of just north-south transfers for the eventual Kyoto Protocol way down the track. So they said, what can we do to help? And the idea was, well, let's conceptualize it and let's test it out. So the Norwegians funded the bank, a unit in the Environment Department, to develop this conceptual framework, which we did. What would a commodity that we called emissions reductions look like? How would you define it? How would you transact it in legal terms and all the rest of it, and how would you measure it? And that's where we did this boiler conversion in Poland and the compact fluorescent light bulb transition from incandescence in Mexico. And through that, it gave us the meat on the bones of the framework to be more confident that we could get this done. And then it was going quite well until one of the conferences of the parties, because of course we were ambitious and we kept talking about this a lot. And one of the African delegates got up and said, I would like to have the COP book the World Bank for speeding, because they're getting way ahead of the negotiators and what the negotiators want, and we don't like this. And that was a sort of calming moment, to say the least, because what we had to learn to do after that, which is quite a skill, it takes a lot of diplomacy, which I don't claim to have a lot of, was lead from behind. Find ways of suggesting to people what might be in their interests, which they then adopt as their own, and forget you. And that was the game we had to play for quite a long time until Jim Wolfensohn came along and had ambitions to make, in his words, the World Bank relevant again.
And I recall Jim Wolfensohn having a critical role to actually play in encouraging you in particular in moving forward with the idea. I think that was the beginning of 96 or 97. And how important is the role of somebody like Jim Wolfensohn in an institution like the bank to create a whole new framework?
Yeah. Look, it's extraordinary and essential to do what we eventually got done, or anything of that magnitude. It can't be done without the leadership from the top, the ultimate authority and empowerment. And it was, what happened there was really interesting and needs to be taken into account by managers up and down the chain, because it could easily have been destroyed as well. So Jim launched a competition. He wanted to make the bank relevant, and he said, I want ideas. And I'm setting up an innovation committee. I don't know what its precise name now in hindsight, but it was an innovation committee with outside judges. And he said, I want ideas, and I want them by the end of, it was December 95, I think. So we were in the calm period of, perhaps this is not going to go anywhere, and we're told to, mind our own business. So we quickly put together the concept for him and this competition. And fortunately, I had the support of Andrew Steer, my manager, and the vice president, Ismail Serageldin, at that time, to put this up. That was critical. So we put it up, and lo and behold, we sort of won the prize. We were ranked number one, and Jim, of course, came from the marketplace and loved the idea of markets. And so by February of 96, he had allocated to us the prize money, which was $3.25 million to go and set up what we then called, for the courtesy and diplomacy of the world, the prototype carbon fund. Not the bank was going to take over and build the market per se, but we'd help launch it. And I have to say that that was another period of great tension for me, because here I was, I suppose, what was I then, maybe not even director level, and all these people in between. And Wolfensohn would call me up all the time and come see me, or say, tell me to come see him. And that, you can imagine, that caused tension. Why didn't you tell me you're going to see the boss? And fortunately, there was enough goodwill at that time that it was understood that that's the way Wolfensohn behaved. If he wanted to talk to people way down the ladder, he would do that. And my job was to quickly scurry back and tell the rest what we had in mind. So it was empowering, and he followed through. He decided that he would talk to heads of state. He would talk it up. We did little shorts, you recall, little videos that we could roll out whenever we went to a meeting with a client, a government client. We could play Jim Wolfensohn saying, "This is the best thing since sliced bread." and that was, amazingly powerful. I doubt very much that governments would have paid as much attention and put their money in if it hadn't have been for his support.
And looking back, prior to setting up the prototype carbon fund, you had already played a pioneering role in putting together the multilateral fund for Montreal Protocol, then the Global Environment Facility. In what way was this intended to be different from those facilities that you had set up?
Well, I was part of the team that designed the Global Environment Facility, and I was the GF's first employee. Eventually became the equivalent of the sort of CIO on the bank side. But it wasn't my idea, and I helped conceptualize it and bring the deal flow in, and of course did the pilot phase, led the pilot phase. The difference was that this seemed to be a natural outgrowth of what the bank would do. It was nothing particularly strange about it. Whereas the carbon market was very unusual because it uniquely had the bank, as the World Bank and not the IFC, bringing together partnerships with major global corporations. And the vision was huge and long term, and truly global in scale. The GF is a great instrument, but it's limited by the aid flows. Ultimately, how much would you give for this compared to the overall envelope of spend that governments have? And so one is limited, the other is unlimited, and then the role playing for the bank was extraordinary. We broke new ground and created a lot of controversy in the process.
I think you indicated that the difference between the GF and the carbon business was linked to the sources of funding, right? That governments were putting in money in the GF, whereas the carbon business was supposed to use the capital markets.
Yes.
At what point did carbon finance become what is today called result-based finance versus financing the project itself, the way GF and the Green Climate Fund finances it? Because I remember the first project that we did in Latvia, the waste management project, was in that same mold as the GF. We were putting in money, co-financing with the IBRD.
Yes.
At what point did you think about moving it towards result-based finance, which has transformed the way international finance now works?
Yes. Yeah, it's very interesting looking back and using the terminology of today, pay for performance, results-based financing, and realizing that we were the pioneers in that movement. And we didn't use that terminology at all. But what we knew we were creating was a commodity, and we knew it had to be subject to the rules of commodity finance. We spent a lot of time looking for parallels. When we were pitching to the private sector, we didn't want to go to the private sector and appear to be World Bank sort of development finance guys that they wouldn't understand. We had to talk to them in their language. So in drafting the pitch document, we had to talk in terms of closed-end mutual funds and products, and the commodity financing was, you want to get a coal mine finance, you sell forward the coal. Any other examples also in the energy, in the petroleum business. And so we thought in those terms. And so results-based financing just seemed to be a natural partner to the evolution of carbon, a kind of derivative of the energy business for obvious reasons. And so we sort of adopted it. I don't think it was a particularly conscious decision. And one of the reasons why it fell into place naturally was none of the buyers of carbon, and even the investors in the Prototype Carbon Fund, wanted to put capital at risk up front and take what the World Bank was always used to taking, which was kind of project risk. If the project fails, too bad, you've blown your money. It was natural that since we were writing contracts to purchase emissions reductions, that we would minimize our risk by not paying in advance for the emissions reductions, that we would pay on delivery. So that seemed obvious, good commercial practice, good risk management, and parallel to what the rest of the world did in the commodity markets, in the energy business as well. So it just evolved that way. I don't ever remember having a discussion about anything other than risk management in terms of whether you pay up front. And I think maybe we did once or twice, you'll recall, paid something up front because the project financier just couldn't find the equity or couldn't find the financing. But as a principle, very early on we said, no, we're not doing that. We're paying on delivery. And that effectively, we can now look back and describe it as results-based financing.
Yeah. And in those early days, I mean, the idea was to try to do it around World Bank projects, and the carbon finance business, if you look back, the first 5-10 years of it is mostly based on third-party projects, not World Bank projects. And
very important.
Yeah, and how do you think that came about, and what was the impact of that on the overall business, and how is it different today?
Well, it evolved around this nonsense concept of mainstreaming. It's fine if there is a role for the World Bank and it's a natural partner to development finance, that you talk about mainstreaming, but it was a totally misplaced notion for the carbon finance business. Because after all, we were trying to create a global market, and our role was to illustrate through demonstration across as many asset classes and engaging as many of our developing country clients and the private sector in the developing countries to understand the opportunity and then to run with it if we could convince the parties to the convention and regional governments to create the market demand. That's a far cry from saying, well, this is the World Bank's product and therefore it has to be seamlessly integrated into the World Bank. But that's what we were commanded to do. Just like the Global Environment Facility and just like Montreal Protocol, you had to mainstream it in every sense, in accounting and promotion internally. So I think, and I say this with a little hindsight, but I was aware, even after I left the bank, how that was going off the rails. That there seemed to be something to do with scale for its own sake inside the bank, and in order to get the scale, we needed to somehow integrate carbon finance with the scale of the World Bank's lending. But what we did in the first place was completely appropriate. We had lots of little private sector companies to whom we said, we will buy this product. Let's see whether together we can make sense of it, and we can create a methodology which creates the environmental integrity, that whole concept of stuff, and we're going to have an experiment together. Every project was a learning experience. But we didn't look inside the World Bank at that time. And for very obvious reasons, the bank had way since the 50s gone out of project finance, except really big mammoth projects, and much more into policy-based lending from the 80s onwards. and to try and find a fit for the kind of projects that we could afford to invest in with the scale of money, considerable in absolute terms, but hundreds of millions is really small for the World Bank, and then broken up in $3, $5, $20 million bits. It didn't make sense. You know, just as it doesn't make sense for a Wall Street bank to invest in something below 50 or 100 million bucks these days. It really didn't make sense for the bank, but that's what we did. And so as we grew capital under management, we first of all looked internally to try and find a home for it. And that gave rise to terrible judgments, I think. You know, I can remember two kinds of projects. I'm not going to get into the specifics because you know them very well, but a major South Asian developing country was, you know, borrowed for lighting and went through the World Bank's, you know, procurement process to get the product, and the lights all failed within a year, and they were on the hook. You know, they used up IDA or whatever it was. And in North Africa, there were major landfill projects that were built on the basis of a promise that emissions reductions would pay off the loan, when the methodology was in error in terms of how much emissions could actually be achieved. But that's the sort of behavior we got into. Promises, you know, influence broking about borrow this and you'll get that. That was really misplaced. So looking back, I should have known better and thought more about that. But, you know, like a lot of people in my position, I was ambitious to grow the impact of what we were doing, and I was focused on more money, more experiments, you know, more frontiers, and I didn't see that coming.
And you know, looking back at those early years, you know, the time Norway put in place the AIJ program, which was a precursor to the Prototype Carbon Fund, to actually establishing the Prototype Carbon. What are the most memorable moments that you can recall even today?
Well, to me, the most memorable moments, apart from the stressful ones of, you know, once we began to get real, then the issue of where you are in the hierarchy and who controls you became an issue. You know, that was on the negative side, and we can talk about many lessons learned for the bank in sponsoring entrepreneurships or intrapreneurs. But to me, the fun thing was, you know, building a team around an exciting new product, which seemed to have no bounds, and every day was a discovery. And the small team, you know, initially is probably only half a dozen people, but grew quite rapidly. But that small team, I think you can recall in the times, it was, you know, we almost met every day because there was so much going on, so much evolution in thinking. We needed to compare notes and keep each other informed, but we did that because we were totally focused. And I love building teams and I love making products, and that experience was extraordinary. So I look back on that with great fondness, but at the same time it had its problems, you know, because we were accused of being a cult. Yeah. That's why I looked up before I came here. What's the definition of a cult? And it's sort of spot on, you know. A small group of people who talks a different language and seems to be obsessed about an object or a practice, and that people don't understand very well, and they think, I'm not sure what you're doing and why you're doing it. That we went through that period. But frankly, that was the only way we could have got this done, that intense focus, passion for what we did. So I loved that time.
Yeah, I have very fond memories of that time as well. It was a very small group of people, 4 or 5 people basically, trying to develop the whole concept with help from some people from outside, but mostly inside the bank. In terms of the constraints, I think the major advantage was that you had the support of Jim Wolfenson right at the top.
In the beginning.
In the beginning. But in terms of the constraints that you could remember and the lessons it has for today when we're trying to do the same with the Paris Agreement-based carbon markets. What are the parallels? What are the lessons? What would you say to people who are involved in this right now?
Well, it's not just this. It's anything new and different, that needs focus and creativity. The lessons we learned, I've often wondered whether they've been taken up, and I actually doubt they have been. So it's very nice to talk about them and hope we get other fora in which we can discuss them, because one of the regrets I had was that there was a team in the very beginning funded by the Norwegians, which was developing the concept, and that team was marketing the product to the clients all around the world. The clients being either the corporates who invested in the initial prototype carbon fund or the sovereigns themselves. And they became very skilled, very talented. And when it came time to set up the prototype carbon fund and regularize employment around the carbon, what became the carbon finance business, those guys were told, you don't have a role. You don't fit the profile of who the bank wants to hire. As if the people in an entrepreneurial outfit should somehow take on the makeup of the human resource procurement policy of the institution as a whole. And so in that transition, we lost 2 or 3 really valuable people. One had a birthday recently, by the way, and I sent her a note.
This is Ruby?
Yeah.
Okay.
That shouldn't happen.
Yeah.
And then inside the unit itself, which I'm sure you remember very well, instead of saying to this entrepreneurial unit, which was then, because we became well-funded, right? And the tensions around us being well-funded, I think, also helped those in the mainstream think a little negatively about us. So the negative overtones were, well, if you want to stay there, you can forget promotion in the rest of the bank.
Yeah.
You're not in the bank. You're in this funny little thing, and you can only stay there a certain amount of time, otherwise it's going to jeopardize your career. That's the last thing you want to say to a team of people who have got your endorsement, have got the endorsement of the bank's clients, and who really need support in a very tough environment to prove up a concept. So the idea should be, in my view, if you succeed for as amount of time that it's necessary to determine whether it's a success or not, you should have the benefit of that as a contribution to your career in the bank. If, however, you've taken the risk and this fails, well then, okay, you've done this consciously. You don't write it off because all failure gives its own lessons. But you can expect, you might have lost 2 or 3 years in climbing a conventional pathway in the bank. But there ought to be both the carrot and the stick. You shouldn't be told, now you're in an entrepreneurial unit and you've got nowhere to go unless you leave. And that was the very wrong message. And I just feel that it's a natural outcome of a large institution. It's not necessarily the bank. I think it's institutional behavior. But we felt that a lot. And the more money and more attention we got, the more those tensions built over time. And I think that's regrettable. So I'm all for kind of skunk works. They have to have an explicit mandate and their own resources, but they should be looked upon with pride, and people should go into them with excitement, feeling they're making a contribution to the institution and not leaving the institution and their career behind.
Let's focus a little bit about the external environment, right? The internal environment was very challenging. I remember most of us who were there in the early team had to take a hit on our careers, right? I mean, because we wanted to work on it, most of us had come from outside, except a few, but had come from outside, so we didn't know any different.
Right.
We followed the cult leader.
Sorry about
that. I think it was a very fulfilling career in the bank, if it wasn't along the traditional path that people follow. I think still wouldn't do it any differently. But turning a little bit to the outside, I mean, who were the key players who made it all possible? Who would you say still need to take a leadership role as we move forward in this new environment?
Well, one can't forget the Dutch and the Scandinavians. They have a history of being innovative and having a focus on innovative finance in the development finance world. Small countries with large hearts and spending a great deal of time thinking about their role in the world and how they can be influential. So certainly the Norwegians were really prominent in the early days. As you say, they funded the bank's participation in the AIJ program, activities implemented jointly, and they gave us the walking around money to develop concepts. But they also took whatever we learned, or we learned with them together, into the negotiating context of the conventions and the Kyoto Protocol itself, with tremendous impact. And so they and the Dutch, I suppose ultimately Ivo de Boer was probably the most influential when it came down to it as a negotiator for a market-based approach in Kyoto, explicitly building on everything that he had learned with us and his staff had learned with us in the build-up to the prototype carbon fund, all of the thinking that went into what's a methodology and how would the market work, and all that sort of stuff was grist for his mill. But he was adequately supported by Sweden, Norway, and others that I probably missing out. But that core of negotiators, armed with information and with a clear conceptual framework of how you would make a market work, and being able to talk to examples which we had provided them in the years of preparing, until we closed in 2000, April, was really powerful. So that's leading from behind. It's something the bank obviously can do, but has to be very careful in doing it. But it shows you the power of the partnership between a thoughtful development institution has the time and resources to think through problems and support generations of governments and government leaders and negotiators, but has the patience not to blow it by saying, oh, this was my idea and we know how to do this, because that was surefire way of failure. So, but those guys were critical. Wouldn't have happened without them. And they, as you know, Ivo went on to play a significant role, both as secretary, executive secretary of the convention, and later.
Yeah. No, I remember Sweden, Ole Björk, Finland, Polly Mustonen, the Norwegian company Statoil, Gas de France, entities which continued support despite the difficulties, despite the controversies that would happen during the COPs and the in between as well, where we had to hide our badges. The blue badges had to be replaced by the green ones for the NGOs just to attend those meetings. Is that an environment that you see even today, where there are companies which are in the space who are willing to stand up and support this agenda, or is that something we've lost?
That's a really interesting question, and I haven't given much thought to it. I'm in the cut and thrust of the market as it grows again, and well, I'm working with governments for sure, and thinking through how Article 6 can work outside of the standards, carbon standards, and the cumbersome process of verification and issuance and so on. Governments are the primary movers now, like the Swiss Click Fund and the Swedes going out to request ideas and appoint consultants who can come up with how they might use Article 6 transactions but they're government-to-government transactions in which they come to agreement on the rules, you know, and so I'm always saying, well, don't forget the private sector, because you could easily make a big mistake, because the private sector is the most motivated, most thoughtful, and capable of great entrepreneurship, and other actors in there are less so, and it's just not in their DNA. So I don't know how that will work. But in the US at the moment, I'm working with corporates, quite different and rather bizarre to me to talk about, you know, the US at the moment. But California is really, in the terms of climate policy, not part of the US in a sense. It's its own country. And there, I'm working with corporates who show all the same form of entrepreneurship that, you know, the likes of British Petroleum and you know, Rabobank, or, you know, all of the companies that were part of our prototype carbon fund. They show all that enthusiasm and innovation around, for them, doing what they think is right to manage their climate impact. But it's at kind of like the sub-sovereign level. They're not at the negotiating table. And I don't know, I've not been attending COPs for the last couple of years, so they're all there promoting themselves as climate neutral, but what influence do they have on the negotiations? That's unclear to me.
And do you sense that the governments themselves, the Nordic governments and perhaps Germany and a few others of that nature, have kind of shifted their position from you know, the faith in the market? Because remember, when you were setting up the carbon fund, Europeans were the ones who wanted regulations to control climate change. It was the US which was pushing for market-based instruments. Do you see the Europeans continuing to have faith in the ability of markets to address this challenge, or is it more driven by the governments and the companies are taking a back seat?
No, I have to say that the European governments are a great disappointment to me at the moment. If anything, they're kind of writing off all of the embedded lessons in the Kyoto era, which was, you know, obviously market focused, and saying that the faults that everybody saw in the market were, as far as they were concerned, lethal, and making no attempt to manage them, and taking markets out of the picture in terms of their positions going forward. That's terribly disappointing. And I don't think it can last, because their ambitions, on the other hand, as you might expect, especially, you know, Germany and Northern Europeans, their ambitions are quite large to, you know, under their NDCs to do well. But there's no hope in hell they can meet those ambitions or even ramp them up to something that might actually legitimately begin to address the global problem, which they're all far short of in a collective sense, without turning to markets. And so what's really interesting to me is the newly industrializing countries, let's say not the old wealth and old capital and old industrialization, but the new industrialization is much more favorable to markets than the Europeans. And it's just unfortunate that you know, the most market-oriented bloc in the world, you know, North America is out of it for other reasons we all well know, but not actually inside the US. That's a different story. As I said, California is very market-oriented, and it's a big economy. So yeah, I feel somehow they've taken some faults from the learning by doing period of the Kyoto Protocol and just regarded them as unfixable. And they have their opinion, they're entitled to it, but the right thing to do was to regard Kyoto as we always regarded it, having no impact whatsoever on the climate, negligible reductions on a global scale in emissions reductions, but entirely a learning by doing process, from which the lessons would be huge and should be mined to give rise to a more perfect market and a more perfect process, set of actors and relationships between actors, policies and marketplaces that would better address climate change going forward. And they seem to have forgotten that, because you can fix this relatively easily. And Article 6, the way it's structured, is very soft and malleable. You can get lots of outcomes from that really derive those lessons and provide greater flexibility. You know, 'cause when we were discussing this way early on, my recollection was, in the conceptual framework I put forward in Delhi at that time, was there would be one global market, right? There would be a global commodity, and it was all based on the low marginal cost of abatement and the quest to drive the developing countries into cleaner and better, more efficient energy with the help of carbon finance, recognizing the externalities of greenhouse gases. And this would be a global tradable commodity valued at trillions. Even when I was in Goldman Sachs, we used to talk in those terms, that the carbon market globally would be bigger than traded natural gas, you know. Well, that world has gone away, and the whole market is voluntary now, effectively. There might be cap and trade regimes within a country or even a few countries, but what they do to meet their ambitions is entirely up to them. And so, in my view, it's a voluntary market. But it also, therefore, creates the opportunity to perfect the market instruments that were tried at great expense and with enormous resources over the Kyoto period. And I think throwing that rather large baby out with the bathwater is what the Europeans are about at the moment. And I hope it's rescued. I can even see one or two countries, Korea is a great case in point now, an agent of growth in the early Paris market. But there are others who can make coalitions and demonstrate how to resuscitate the best of these markets.
Ken, you remember the period between, say, 2004 and the anticipation of Russian ratification of the Kyoto Protocol in 2005 and the push by the private sector to identify and address the HFC reductions, which really, I think, was the transformational point for the carbon market. It was then that it arrived on the scene as a serious player. Before that, the World Bank carbon funds were dominant in the market, 20, 30, 40% of the total market share. But the HFC deal in December 2005 transformed it all. I mean, how do you remember it, and what do you see were the good parts of it, and how did it turn out from the perspective of how it is seen today? Yeah,
interesting you should ask, because I think about that a lot today. I've never stopped thinking about it. Whenever anybody asks, what's the most important things in the market that you might have done differently or think about differently. And I'm still torn today, to be honest, because we in the carbon finance business very strongly pushed China at the time to abandon a stance which at least the Ministry of Finance officials said that they had, after some consideration, that they would not monetize the perfluorocarbons and the HFC assets, that they'd rather have the carbon market serve Western China underdeveloped renewable energy plays. And our overture to them was, but you can take a major leading position in the market, you can add liquidity to the market, which is very important. You can generate resources from opening up those 11 factories at the time. More were discovered by the private sector after, and monetizing those extraordinary emissions reductions, and it's all great for climate. The simplicity was obvious. No one would put an incinerator on the back end of a chemical plant and just burn money to burn gases, so it wasn't going to happen. And you remember we said, okay, well, this is a lot of money, so why don't we, we constructed with Charlotte Streck and others outside the bank at that time, a nice taxation system, 65% of the revenue from HFC projects, and nitrous oxide, I think it was 45 or something, and it did accumulate a few $billion. Yeah. So we lived with that in our conscience. Okay, fine, we're creating liquidity to the market, and it's going to do good things. I often thought back, after the European market collapsed, that if that volume wasn't in the market, the focus would have been on much more sustainable energy solutions, which the Europeans fawned over and thought was where carbon finance was going. And it gave them the excuse that to think, well, all these people got rich on 50 cent to $1 HFC carbon. They're all carbon cowboys, and that's the worst aspect of the market. And so it was easier for them, Josh Delbecchi was one of those who criticized this very heavily, to say, we don't want that kind of market, And so, I think there's some credence in that. I blame myself a few times for being so aggressive with the Chinese and seeing the excitement in terms of what they felt they could do, and then realizing, boy, that helped them completely dominate the market. And then there was an oversupply. An oversupply helped kill it because the Europeans refused to believe that it was actually a policy-based market, and they could change it by restricting the flow of emissions, of EU allowances, and right it. They just walked away from it because of that sense that this was somehow illegitimate. But the other side of that is the $40 billion, or whatever number it really is, that's just what stuck in my mind, of private capital which flowed into the market at that time, would not have come if there wasn't the promise of reasonably profitable business that would raise, on the prospect of which they would raise large amounts of money, pension fund money, all kinds of institutional money, and bring the big investment banks into it. At the margin, when those early assets were depleted, that money had to do harder things and discover all kinds of ways of doing business, which had the seeds of tremendous insight as to how you would give rise to a sustainable energy future or sustainable waste management, and that is a huge resource which we would have foregone if we didn't create that incentive de facto to bring such capital and entrepreneurship into the market. Because when I left the bank, and you had the same experience, there was a tremendous amount of talent that came into the carbon market to do carbon investments and think through the structuring and the technical issues. So much discovery was going on, which was of great value to a sustainable, climate-friendly future. So I'm torn. I see it from both sides. But I'm absolutely committed now that I'm, avowedly in the private sector, and see the benefits of it for those who want to take risks in the poorest countries and markets in the world. I see that that's really critical. That I'm trying. I want to be humble, and I have a very small company, but I see day after day that no NGO can do what small, flexible private companies can do in the rural areas of developing countries, and in many asset classes. It's not part of their DNA, it's not part of their mandate, and it's so essential that the future captures that vitality going forward.
No, if I can push back a little bit on the HFC side, because my own sense is that we as an institution failed to tell the correct story around it. The market was intended to, a market instrument is intended to discover what policy usually fails to address, right? Going into the Kyoto markets, I don't think there was a recognition that there was this massive asset class called the HFC. And the market was successful, and the private sector was successful in finding it, right? Which policymakers and the governments hadn't recognized. And within a 1 year to 1.5 year period, each and every HFC project had been identified, and you had implemented HFC destruction, which if you try to do it by policy or the way Montreal Multilateral Fund did, it would have taken years. So in my sense, I think it was incorrect verdict on the failure on the part of the policymakers not to recognize that this whole idea of the market where you're supposed to make money while doing good, that was the whole concept around it, was taken to be some sort of a unreasonable amount of money that the private sector made. But think of the scale of action that took place, and I think we as an institution, the World Bank as an institution, failed to put that narrative out there, and as a result of which people started feeling that perhaps this was a wrong turn in the whole carbon market. That's one. And the second part I think I want to emphasize is the point that you made on the talent that it brought, the attention that it brought into the whole carbon market by bringing in a whole set of banking institutions, private sector, that I think transformed the whole energy system and kind of was the initial push for the renewables. No, is that your sense as well?
Oh yeah. I mean, first of all, they were for the great majority, they were young guys, right? Young men and women, and the teams that I worked with, the very few people with white hair. They were just excited by the mission. It was a highly legitimate mission. They felt there was an opportunity to do well by doing good, as you say. They were hungry, and they had a mandate to go and find the opportunities, and the opportunities were boundless. So, no, I totally agree that it was extremely useful to have some assets which could legitimize the investment of capital from relatively conservative sources, that pouring billions into funds. To unleash that, to gather and unleash that talent. And it hasn't really gone away. It's sort of there dormant. What's gone away is the confidence in the financial sector, the powerful global financial sector players who played a big role in that market, that the policymakers won't pull the rug from under them again. And so they'll be very nervous to invest. But smaller entrepreneurial shops will set up in great numbers over the next few years, and they'll draw on people who cut their teeth on that period, because they're still, in my sense, very young people, and they'll bring a new breed in with them. I'm just concerned that it's much more it's a more haphazard process. It does need leadership and vision from governments, that the private sector is critical to this process. And I see it in some governments. I see it in Australia, for example, even though I don't necessarily abide where the current Australian government is going. I see the marketplace and key stakeholders, talking up the private sector, and they're already playing an important role. Korea we've talked about, and so it goes on. I understand what you're saying. I'm acutely aware that when you let the private sector in, they'll find the flaws in the policy environment. That's really what they're there to do. And if the governments weren't quick enough to close the loop in the Montreal Protocol, well, that's their problem. They shouldn't turn around and say, well, the money you earned was illegitimate. And by the way, not too many people made a lot of money in the carbon market. There's a few examples here and there, but a hell of a lot went belly up as well.
So to conclude, I mean, what are the key lessons over the last 20 years that you think should be taken into account as the market instruments for Paris are designed? What would your advice be to the current set of leaders here and to the private sector entrepreneurs as well?
Yeah, well, we'd always come back and use this term for the World Bank, that its convening power is extraordinary. Its convening power has got to be based on well thought out policies, and it's not all about growing the bank per se. The bank is about helping its clients, and its primary clients for the World Bank part of the World Bank Group are governments. And so I think there's been a kind of passive internalization of the lessons, that we're not somehow trying to grow our own lending program, but we're trying to use markets to make our lending program more meaningful for clients, to strive towards a climate-friendly, more sustainable energy future. And but there has to be, that always needs to be like the opening of a meeting, like almost like a prayer, you know. This is the bank's role. These are things that the bank shouldn't be doing, and here's where the alignment is, and here's the role the bank can play in having a truly extraordinary market transformational impact through connecting players rather than being the player. Facilitation, coming up with ideas, but not ideas that you then seek to implement, you know, for your own sake and to grow your own sense of self-importance, but to effectively do what we were doing ultimately by force, leading from behind, coming up with ideas because we have the time and resources and the talent to do it, but then quietly infusing these ideas for those governments who now have the opportunity under Article 6 to be extraordinarily innovative, because it's not one instrument, it's whatever you want to make it to be, and that's you know, that's amazing. So I think that's very important to have an internal discussion about, you know, really what we're trying to achieve and how we're going to achieve it. But it still comes down to you know, creating entrepreneurial teams, and more so than ever, because it isn't one instrument, it's not one market. So you know, I feel it's time again to invest, provide resources to come up with opportunities which you might quietly suggest to governments who have resources and ambition to do a lot more, you know, how they might do that and what sort of partnerships they might sponsor.